Thank you, everyone. Hola, amigos. Gracias. So thank you so much for having me here at JSConf Columbia. So this is, like Juan said, this is my first time in the beautiful city of Medellin, and I've been having a wonderful time eating like arepas and drinking jugo de mango. It's been great. I love it. So to introduce myself, I'm Helen. My name is Helen, and I'm a designer, and I work in code bases. So in the past, I have worked with both Capital One, which is a big bank in the United States, as a front-end developer and a prototyper. And then after that, I worked with Mozilla Firefox on their developer tools team as a UX designer. At the beginning of the year, I started my own business, and now I'm a freelancer, and I work with a bunch of companies now, or I've worked with a bunch of companies this year in more and more code bases, so like GitHub and Heroku, Fastly. So part of being multidisciplinary means I've worn lots of hats. I've done everything from creating illustrations to making vector graphics, to wireframes, to UI mockups for websites. And sometimes it means that I write React components and I build websites from scratch or anything else that needs to be done. So I'm obviously a designer who codes a lot. And I find that having someone in your code base who is thinking about design details at a code level gets you better experiences. So I'll explain this photo in a second, but when I went to university for graphic design, during my time there, I knew that I wanted to build websites because my very first websites were really, really bad, but there was nothing more magical than building something that like you put up at a URL and you could send it to your friends and family. It was really magical. So this is a photo of my friend who drew me in university, like working furiously at my computer and typing. So I'm sorry for the profanity, but it was like really funny to share. So I taught myself to code through internships and friends, and mostly through like programmers who were willing to be generous with their time and their expertise and to teach me. So over the years, I've been able to tackle bigger and bigger code challenges, even though I never went to school for it. Mostly because people have been really kind to me and have been willing to help me solve problems in code bases and to make them friendly for people like me, who are mostly worried about solving visual problems in our websites and apps. Actually, as a quick aside, one of them is in the audience right now, one of the developers who taught me how to program. So big thanks to Emily. She's looking embarrassed at me. Okay. Thanks, Alex. So I say all of this because I've given this talk lots of times, and it changes a bunch every single time I give it. Over the years, my mindset on how we can best bring designers into code bases has changed drastically as I join different teams, as the one person who isn't a developer. Bringing a designer into your team of engineers can be hard from both managerial and technical standpoints, and many of the teams I've worked on have had good intentions, but don't know how to make code bases places for designers to do their best work. But luckily, I am here to tell you exactly how to do that. So the short answer for how we do that sort of stuff is that we challenge our assumptions that we have about the way our code bases and our team dynamics work. By doing this, we allow ourselves to create the kind of spaces where the designer on your team feels comfortable jumping in and fixing visual problems in the final product that our users actually see, as opposed to design comps in Illustrator or Sketch or Photoshop. In comparison to like using Slack or sending emails with follow-ups on like an already built design, like this just tends to be like, this kind of proactive attention at a code level tends to be worth its weight in gold. So, but before we get started, I wanted to explain what I mean by that more explicitly. The reason that I care so heavily about making code bases that are welcoming to designers is that as a designer, nothing is more frustrating than passing off a design you're really excited about and then having the final product just like not look quite right. Like, oh no. And I want to say that this isn't about blame, because developers find this frustrating too. As people who are in careers where all we want to do is like make things cool and amazing, we all want to be proud of our finished products, not just designers, but also developers. I'll just want to make really, really cool things with lots of sparkle emojis. So the reason that this happens, this stuff happens typically for simple reasons. As a developer, you have a set of priorities and a mindset that you bring to your development. You know, you need to get content on the page, you need to set up a code base other developers can follow, You gotta optimize images and code for seed. You gotta set up routes and views and controllers if you're using a framework. You gotta not leak customer data. You gotta make sure forms work and content downloads and the site is accessible. And all of this stuff is just like the tip of the iceberg of all the different things that we need to be able to do to like complete like a project. I can imagine that probably like as a developer, you're not doing stuff. You probably didn't learn to like spot the difference between like Arial and Helvetica by eye, which is like stuff that I learned in school, or know the number of words you should have in a line of copy for optimal reading length, both of which are 100% things that affect how our sites look like when they're done. And for the curious, you can tell these apart from the R and the A. That's how you tell apart Arial from Helvetica. And the optimal number of characters in a line tends to be somewhere between 45 to 75 characters, depending on the typeface you set it in. Anyway, as a designer, we have a different set of priorities, and they tend to start off in the same place. We tend to need to think about getting content on a page. We also need to make certain that it's typeset properly, and that the content is legible, that the colors follow the brand guidelines, that the design doesn't break when you stretch the website really wide or when you crunch it really small. You gotta make certain that the flows through the website are coherent, that our content makes sense. Having a designer who can jump in at the end of a process and clean up final details is the key to fixing this discrepancy that's so frustrating. But when we make the assumption that our code bases are easy to jump into, designers tend to disagree, and then they don't clean up those last ends, and we end up shipping products that like, could have been better. All right, so I want to challenge some of our assumptions that we have about our code bases, starting with number 1. New members to the code base will be able to traverse and understand the code base simply by reading the code. This tends not to be true. This is a common mistake. Just because you understand something, it doesn't mean that other people understand it as well. Or even the more nefarious version, like, oh, if you're a good enough developer, you should be able to understand it just by reading the code. But if we want designers in our code bases, expecting them to understand what's going on from like the code alone is kind of a crazy ask. So the answer to correcting this is documentation. Specifically, I find 2 kinds of documentation helpful. I think it's good to have high-level overview documentation of your code base with explanations for where in the code base certain kinds of code can be found. For example, like your designer is really only probably going to care about like your views, your HTML, and your CSS. And then low-level code commenting about how specific, more complex blocks of code work. I prefer inline commenting for this, but I know some teams use Gitbook, which is what I have up on the screen here, or various methods of like on-the-side level commenting. The point is that you shouldn't assume others will understand your code base simply because you're familiar with it and you do. So the second assumption I want us to challenge is because we as developers don't do much UI work, additional tooling to make UI work easier is overkill. So this also isn't true. If you want a designer in your code base, this changes simply because they exist now. You'll have at least one person who is worried about visual problems all of the time, and tiny problems, like tiny little paper cuts, like having to reload the page every time they make a change to the code, can become huge wastes of time for that person. So the solution to this problem is to set up tools that will make working on visual tools or visual problems in your code base easier. This will not only improve your designer's productivity in your code base, but also anyone else who needs to touch CSS at whatever point, as it shortens the feedback loop between design changes and seeing them in context. So in my time at Firefox, when I first started, we didn't have any sort of auto reloading. Auto reload tooling, and so in order to see any CSS changes, we had to like start and restart a server. I don't know if this is playing. This is a video just where it shows like how auto reload works, which you probably already know. But the point is that like after auto reload got put into our code base, my productivity like skyrocketed. It was so much easier to work in that code base. So one of my favorite tools for this is browser sync. I am absolutely in love with browser sync. We'll see if this video works. There we go. So the reason browser sync is so cool is that it uses local port tunneling, so your designer can see updates at different media breakpoints across responsive apps and websites on different devices in real time. So here I'm just trying to show you that it like works across different browsers as opposed to like taking a video of like a phone doing it. But you can pull up your website on your phone with your computer's IP address, and it's really great way to like speed up one of the more clunky parts of building responsively. So assumption number 3, because we don't write much CSS currently, we don't need tools that make working with CSS easier. So I don't believe in this one either. If you have a designer in your code base, odds are they're going to be the person who ends up writing a bunch of CSS. And so being kind to them by setting up your build pipeline, whether you're using like Gulp or Grunt or Webpack, pick your poison, having more powerful CSS tooling is essential to making that designer feel comfortable in the code base. Personal favorite for me is Sass. I really liked Sass because it allowed me to level up my skills gradually by starting with just like plain CSS and then moving up to like more programmatic solutions as I got more comfortable programming. And if you get your designer to work with CSS more regularly instead of only ever designing in design problems, you're going to be pleased with the results. CSS has improved over the years with things such as CSS Grid and Flexbox for layout, box shadow and multiple backgrounds, and CSS variables for UIs. So like the days of exporting like drop shadows as PNGs is long behind us. So getting your designer to think about how they can take their designs and build them with CSS, get them into a coding mindset as they plan out future work. I'm gonna skip over those. Those are just like cool CSS3 things. A resource I really like for getting your designer excited about CSS is Adam Schwartz's Magic of CSS. It's a really cool little microsite. So getting your designers working with CSS frequently makes a lot of sense, as CSS is declarative in a way that is closer to GUIs than programming. And having programmers and designers work together in this space that is part graphical and part code makes a lot of sense. So you really want your designer to feel really comfortable working with CSS often. Having programmers and designers work together in this space just, yeah, makes a lot of sense. Inevitably, your designer is going to ask you for libraries and frameworks and other things that they believe will make their job easier. And I think it's important to remember that we as engineers have these tools too. So you don't want to brush off designers' engineering requests simply because they're designers. Instead, you want to work with them to understand the problem they're trying to solve by asking you for that framework, and then slot in the time for research planning and building the priorities for your project the same way that you would any engineering request or thing that you wanted to complete. So moving on to assumption 4, because engineering decisions can be made with metrics and data, design decisions should be made this way as well. So I find that design doesn't really work this way quite as well. As engineers, we love benchmarks, and we love being able to prove our decisions to be right or wrong by running A/B tests and gathering data. But good design doesn't always operate this way. Relying too heavily on A/B testing to prove one design decision is better than another can't be the only way that you move designs forward, or else you create this situation where like all you're doing is design by committee with a bunch of people who maybe you're not designers. So the way that we correct this assumption is honestly just to have faith in your designer. While it's challenging to give up control of the UI of your product over to someone else, part of the process is just about letting go and trusting that your designer is trying to make the right decisions for your product. So on to assumption number 5. Because our communication style works for all of our engineers, it will probably continue working just the same if we add a designer. So I found that this tends not to be true. The second you add a designer, you really do have to rethink your communication styles. I actually find this to be one of the most dangerous assumptions we can make about our team structures and our code bases, because bringing a designer means introducing this new and fresh perspective that you don't want to immediately squash. And if you do squash it, it can create all this friction. So adding a designer creates like an interesting dynamic. Out of all the engineers on your team, you now have this one odd person who isn't like all the others and who's worried about different aspects of your application. So to avoid this problem before it starts, having a contingency plan for how you handle differences in opinion is really important. So you want to ask yourself questions like, when new features are discussed, how is it decided what gets prioritized? How do you deal with conflicts in opinions? Knowing ahead of time that you will have like this member of your team who is thinking about different problems and is always going to be outnumbered when things come to a vote, like means that you can know ahead of time that you're gonna have to figure out how to weigh that expertise and advice they're bringing to the table accordingly. So many of us want more design resources. Maybe you don't know how to get them. Having worked in open source myself, I feel this way like even more. The number of designers who work in open source is like very, very small. And considering how many assumptions we make regarding how easy it is to contribute, it's really not that hard to see why. The benefits to having a designer working alongside engineers can go on forever. Like having a designer in your code base give engineers expert to pose questions to specific to your app and your needs. By getting designers in the code base and having them collaborate with engineers regularly, your designers are going to understand the problems engineers are facing with the UX of your application as they build it out. Engineers will also be able to see the thought process of your designer as they find solutions and understand why the solution is proposed instead of having a potentially confusing solution dumped in their email. We find that asset retrieval gets a lot faster. When you ask for photos, JPEGs, SVGs, a small video of an animation, color of a background, all of this gets sped up a lot faster if your designer is just already in the code base, working alongside engineers and plugging in those assets themselves. We find that the baseline of everything improves. Having a designer in your code base understanding engineers' problems allows your engineers to improve the baseline of everything they produce, even if they don't have access to fully fledged mockups. And then, most importantly, having a designer in your code base destroys this natural disconnect between a design program and an actual app. By running, playing with, and building some of the app itself, designers can give you better feedback for all of the scenarios your app will run into, not just some of them. This allows designers to see firsthand like real-life scenarios that engineers are super familiar with that are challenging for designers to account for when they're designing in a vacuum in Photoshop or in Illustrator. So a designer can be like a tiny little cute beginner's mind in your code base. It's an opportunity for your engineers to grow their eye for good design, both graphic and interaction design, and a good time for your designers to learn how difficult building the mock-ups they provide your engineers actually is. A designer can ask why in places your engineers might not want to and help you identify where in your code base you might have obfuscated problems. And a designer in your code base means you'll have better interaction design coming from your designers as they learn that designs are not flat, but they're like touched and moved and people interact with them. Your designers will begin to think about real life applications from the start and not just tacked on at the end. And your engineers get better about thinking through UX problems intelligently and generating better looking defaults when they move beyond the constraints of like this perfectly fleshed out mock-up with everything already solved. So it's really great because everyone learns. But if these are the kinds of skills we want in our code bases and in our open source communities, we need to break down the barriers to entry and do the difficult work of making our code bases accessible for designers. There are, of course, like difficulties in this process. A new team member means having bandwidth for mentorship. Having different disciplines means new perspectives, but it can also mean differences in opinion about the best solution to certain problems. Engineers and the designer on your team might butt heads, and finding equitable ways of solving disputes and coming to solutions can be really challenging. But, and so, you know, like learning environments to be successful need to be calm ones and they need to be positive ones. And so if you want to reap the benefits of having a designer in your code base that I went over, the best advice I can give to you is to like be flexible and be understanding. Putting in the work to make your code base and your team accessible to non-engineers, and you'll reap the benefits of having different perspectives in your products. So I mentioned at the beginning of this talk that one of the things I've always hated is when a website doesn't look like the design I sent over, but I think I hate it even more when designers and developers feel like they can't understand each other, because at the heart of it, we're all just trying to make cool things. Like, designers just don't get it, or like, this is impossible and unrealistic to build. It's very easy for there to be these bad relationships and stress between engineering and design teams, not because either party is wrong, but because each team doesn't know how to accommodate for the other group. If we subvert this and make our code bases places where designers can be members of the team, designers learn what can and can't be built because they've tried to build it themselves. Developers learn how to make things look a little better whether they wanted to learn it or not, because they just have a designer around to ask. So I think that if we, as developers, think about how we can get designers into our code bases, we can worry less about the small stuff and get back to what we all really want to be doing, which is making really cool things. So thank you so much for your time and for being such a great audience. I'm that on Twitter. Thank you, JSConf Columbia.